Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This time on Karl's Spirits, as it is September 1st, we will be celebrating the beginning of what has become one of my favorite months of the year, Bourbon Heritage Month. Now, Bourbon Heritage Month calls for a celebration of bourbon as America's native spirit, and this takes place every September. Way back in 2017, the U.S. Senate declared September '07 as National Bourbon Heritage Month. The bill, which was sponsored by Republican Senator Jim Bunning of Kentucky, passed by unanimous consent. When was the last time you heard of that happening? The resolution calls for consumers to enjoy bourbon, to do so responsibly and in moderation. The bill reinforces the 1964 Act of Congress that declared bourbon America's native spirit. And by celebrating the family heritage, tradition, deep-rooted legacy that the bourbon industry contributes to the United States. That's a quote, by the way. So how cool is that? Bourbon Heritage Month. And there are a lot of different ways we can celebrate Bourbon Heritage Month. I know a very popular one is 30 days in September, try 30 different bourbons, or 15, make one every other day. But be responsible, do it in moderation, but grab yourself a pour of your favorite bourbon. And tonight we're going to do something a little bit different in honor of Bourbon Heritage Month. We're going to do a slight taste-off. Now, it's not going to be a blind tasting, as the differences for me between these two particular bourbons are fairly clear. So we're going to taste two bourbons tonight, and at the end, I'll give the Karl stars for these two pours. So first up, we're going to be looking at Peerless. This is Kentucky Peerless small batch straight bourbon whiskey. This is one of those legacy brands that are currently being resurrected by many different distilleries. Corky Taylor, he's a retired financier from Florida, and he began the Kentucky Peerless brand several years ago, modeled on his great-grandfather's original distillery. That original distillery produced a brand that died out over 100 years ago, and it was revived as a bourbon brand back in 2019. Distilled in Louisville, Peerless first introduced a rye whiskey, and it is a highly acclaimed rye. So in 2019, that was in 2014, I believe, and in 2019, they introduced their bourbon expression. It is a sweet mash. And instead of using the sour mash method, which holds back some of the yeast in the juice in fermenting, the sweet mash has no setback. And so it's a fresh batch of yeast and a fresh batch of juice every single time. They are also using a non-chill filtered process. So the natural particulate, the natural fatty flavors exist in the juice. They have not been removed. So for this Peerless, we are tasting tonight 74% corn, 18 rye, and 8% malted barley. This is 110.1 proof juice, and Peerless says this is aged for 4 years. So we're going to do a little tasting on Peerless, and then we'll move on to our other drink tonight. Now, one thing about this Peerless I think is important. First on the nose, let this thing breathe a little bit. The ethanol is particularly strong at first. It does fade over the next few minutes, but then it has kind of a sweet aroma. A lot of cherries, a little bit of ice cream, and that's kind of appealing to me. I kind of like that. It is not cherry cough syrup, but rather fruit cherry. There's an herbal note in here as well. First of all, it has a thin mouthfeel. The cherry flavor carries through on the taste, but the sweetness of that doesn't. In fact, it becomes kind of a bitter cherry flavor. There's very, very mild sweets in this. It's mostly a bitter, very herbal note to this particular pour. I'm getting lots of grass here, green grass. There's a burn here, and I think it's more alcohol than flavor. It really comes off as a younger bourbon than a standard 4-year-old bourbon should. And to me, being on the thinner side on the mouthfeel, lacking a lot of those great notes, it lacks a lot of complexity. There's just not as much to it as I would particularly like to see. I think this is a decent bourbon, especially if they left it in the barrel a little longer, say another 2 to 4 years. I think this would be very good. It is not my favorite, but it's not my least favorite either. I'm thinking about you, Bibb and Tucker. But what I like least about this bourbon is its price point. $70 bottle. This is a pricey bottle. And it would be really hard to justify using this in a cocktail at this price. But for me, drinking it neat or on the rocks, I did try it with rocks earlier, this just doesn't do it for me. So that's it on Peerless. We're now going to take a look at another bourbon, and this one is Cooper's Craft Barrel Reserve Kentucky Straight Bourbon. Cooper's Craft. This is the first of what would become several new expressions added by the parent company Brown-Forman since they introduced Woodford Reserve almost 20 years ago. Brown-Forman also owns Old Forester and Jack Daniels, but they are also the only major distillery to own and operate its own cooperage. What's a cooperage? Well, it's a barrel making facility. And Brown-Forman started their own cooperage way back in the 1940s, and they have been making their own aging barrels since. This expression is to honor those barrel makers. That's the whole idea by the title Cooper's Craft. It's to honor the role that these people play in the making of really good bourbon. And yes, the barrel plays a major role. For this bourbon, Cooper's actually gouge out or chisel grooves on the inside of the barrel before it's charred. And according to the company brochure, this allows the whiskey to interact more deeply with the wood and creating a more robust and more complex flavor profile, end quote. So what I always think here is this one of those gimmicky bourbon stories? Does this really even matter? Is it really going to translate into taste? So mash bill on this is a fairly standard Brown-Forman mash bill. You're going to find this very, very similar to an Old Forester. You're going to find this very similar to Woodford Reserve. 75% corn, 15% rye, 10% malted barley. Bottled at 100 proof, aged for 4 years. It is a really dark amber with really thick, clingy legs. I don't know if you can tell in the light in here about the differences in color between these two bourbons. This is the Cooper's. This is the Peerless. This is a much darker. This is a bright copper. This is a really dark amber. Very, very different in appearance. Here's the bottle of Peerless. Here's the bottle of Cooper's. So I don't know if you can see that, but there is a huge difference in color. What about taste, though? Because it's really not all about the color. It's about the taste of the juice. Wow, this is a great nose. A lot of those classic bourbon notes that I really enjoy. Leather. It's overlaid with some brown sugars, some caramels, a smoky oak. Very full aromaed, full scented bourbon. Wow. Thick and syrupy mouthfeel. This is a caramel bomb from the get-go. Right on the front of the tongue. And that caramel just warms up as it moves across the palate. That smoky oak and vanilla come down the sides a little bit, get that savory note. There is a slight, ever so slight, hint of what I'm going to call citrus or pear. I can't decide which there as well. At the very, very back of the palate, just as it reaches, we get some sweet cinnamons. And with a little cinnamon burn for the finish, this is actually it actually finishes with a really clean, sharp finish, I think. Almost apple-like, is it? Very clean and sharp. In other words, the burn lingers and then it dissipates fairly quickly. So my takeaway for Cooper's Craft is that this is a bourbon I can really dig. And full disclosure, I may be biased, as I tend to like Brown-Forman products quite a bit, except for Jack Daniels. This reminds me of an Old Forester 1910 or a Woodford Double Oak, two of my favorites. And it probably should. All three use almost exactly the same mash bill. I think there's about a percentage or two difference in the mash bill difference between the Cooper's Craft and Woodford and Old Forester. Two are double aged. For example, the 1910 is aged again in oak, as is the Woodford Double Oak. This is aged in a slightly different way, using a deeply chiseled and heavily charred barrel to impart more flavor. So we're getting a double-aged experience here without actually putting it into two barrels. We've exposed more surfaces of that wood to impact the juice in that barrel. Ultimately, I think it's it's spicy without being hot. It has a really nice spice to it, and there's a nice underlay of sweetness to support that spice. That's that caramel and the vanilla and that smoky oak, really just right there, nice and sweet. The one drawback to the Cooper's Craft is that it is not distributed in Missouri. Currently has a distribution of about 10 states. Our neighboring state, Kentucky, of course, does distribute Cooper's Craft, and that's where I picked up this bottle. A positive for Cooper's Craft, other than its taste, is its price point. And I'm going to get to that in just a moment. So for my coveted Karl Star ratings tonight, we're going to go Peerless first. Floral, kind of an atypical bottle of bourbon, atypical notes of flavor, let's say, for $70 a bottle. I'm going to give this 3.5 stars. I just don't think it has it. It's not bad, but it's not the best either. For Cooper's Craft, solid, smoky, deep, full-flavored bourbon, $30 a bottle. I'm going to give this 4.25 Karl stars. 4.25 stars for the Coopers at $30, 3.5 stars for the Peerless. Now, this is my take. Okay, everyone's tastes are going to be different. I happen to like the taste of this much better than I do this. And I think it's a good example of how price is not necessarily an indicator of quality or taste. And so everyone's their own judge. I like this Cooper's Craft quite a bit. I actually sipped on it last night. I've sipped on it again today several times. I keep coming back that it's a really nice little bottle of bourbon. So to me, $30 Cooper's Craft, much more impressive than the Peerless at $70. At least that's my take. As always, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to stay safe, peace, and happy pours.